My first guest this week is Frank McCormick. He is a teacher, a public school teacher, historian, writer, and founder of the powerful new website, Chalkboard Heresy, where he takes on and explains the dangers of what he calls critical pedagogy. And here is the first segment of our interview. Frank, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charles. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited because the one topic I probably do the most is education. And so I talk about it a lot. And I've had people on from organizations, think tanks, nonprofits, authors who write about education, but I've never actually had an active public school teacher on. So I'm really excited. So this is going to be a really hot conversation for people, and they're going to put this on repeat. So I want to start off by asking, as you see the news and the debates and the question of what is needed in education, how are you taking all of this stuff in?
I know that one thing that's really come to the forefront is ideology in education, critical race theory, and so forth. And my biggest concern is I think the public is being kind of misled when they're being told that these things are not happening, that there's not ideology in education. That's one of my primary concerns, in addition to the logistics of how schools are operating and their failure to achieve results, is also the ideological infiltration that's occurred in schools and especially accelerated in recent years.
Let's get this out of the way then, because you mentioned CRT, and much of the talk has devolved into defining CRT. So I think you agree with me, but I have to ask, should we be arguing the definition of CRT?
You know, one of the problems when you do this is you encounter kind of the no true Scotsman fallacy, where they'll say, well, that's not really it. That's not really, and you get in this kind of game you're playing over what it is and what it isn't. And, you know, kind of like you, I like to look at, okay, well, what are the ideas being taught? And so when people say critical race theory isn't taught, they're partially right. It's not taught, but what you see is praxis, the application of it in schools. That's kind of my thinking on it, that the ideas of critical race theory are there, and they're in teacher trainings, they're in classrooms. Whether they call it critical race theory or not is kind of irrelevant to me. And now they're going to redefine it. So we have to really be specific on what we're talking about.
Obviously, the ones who are opposing the people pushing back against this, one of the arguments is that CRT is not being taught in school. But the other argument, which is really the more sinister one, is they'll say anyone who's opposing what you're calling ideological bend in education is a racist who just doesn't want to teach Black history in schools. So what do you say to that?
I mean, I think that's obviously preposterous. We teach history. We've been teaching Black history. That's been an essential part of American history. And I've never seen an instance where we have not done so, or where it hasn't received attention or focus. I think what they've done is they've kind of claimed this mantle of, well, it's just about teaching history. And what I do is take it a step further, because these aren't just historians who love history for the sake of loving history. What is the point? What are you so interested in about this history? Well, because we have to learn. Well, what do you learn from it? Well, you know, so we can do this today. Okay. So it's about focusing on this history very specifically through a certain narrative lens, so you can help prop up a current narrative, so you can then achieve policy goals. That is how I see it. And so that's why I think it's rather disingenuous when they say it's just about history. I think they know it's not, especially in hyper-focusing. I'm not saying we ignore these things, but when you ask, why do you want to specifically highlight and only talk about these things? Why do you want to present it through this lens? They're trying to reinforce a current narrative by shaping a historical narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's very dangerous in the sense that their focus on it is almost like a Trojan horse. They just want to open the doors to that so they can get to all these other things, because this claim that people don't want to teach Black history is just factually inaccurate, because what they're doing is pretty slick. You see these comments and you hear people saying things like they want to teach revisionist history, because it's true that many schools across the country taught an alternative version of the cause of the Civil War and the treatment of blacks in the past. Totally true. What they don't tell you is that was, between 1941 and 1963, and nobody's doing it today. So acting as if that is what's currently happening, there's nowhere in the country that they're teaching that slavery was good. That's silly. Now, what they'll say then is that, yeah, but they don't teach enough of the Black history. Well, I said, well, one, who gets to dictate what enough is? Well, you'll say, well, you want more of it, but you're not going to get a history course for a whole 4 years of high school that is just that. That's one problem. They're also starting this stuff really young. So what they're trying to teach people in kindergarten through third grade is weird. And notice that these people who are pushing this, saying history is so important because we learn from it, want to teach the negative, but they don't want to teach anything positive. They don't say anything positive about America. They want to highlight what they claim are negative things that aren't being taught. So how do you teach only a negative history of a country and expect positive outcomes to come from it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Starting with what you originally said, what they've kind of done is they've constructed this straw man to argue with, where you say, where does this happen? Well, they've kind of created this fake opponent that they can argue with, where apparently, from what I've heard but never seen, we're teaching these, slavery in a positive light. And I'm sure you can find isolated instances of that, but I've never seen it on a curricular level. I've never seen it in practice. What happens with students learning this presented in a certain way is that I think it shapes their perception of people today, the students sitting in their classroom. You have students sitting next to them and they're being framed as historical oppressors and they're being framed as victims. How does that impact social relationships among students? And I think the answer is it creates a lot of division and a lot of tension and a lot of problems.
So let's now talk about the problem. So, we got CRT out of the way. So what is actually happening in the schools from a curriculum standpoint, from a shift in, you talk about ideology and political teachings in the school? What is the problem that is happening in schools that you see?
What it's referred to is critical pedagogy. And that's kind of a new term to a lot of people. And so a lot of this, when we talk about the ideology that's problematic in education, it's critical pedagogy. And what that is it's meant to critically deconstruct education. So it operates under this idea that education is inherently oppressive. Education is influenced by white supremacy. It has become a tool of white supremacy and therefore must be deconstructed. And so this influences practice in terms of operating under this assumption, the curriculum that's selected, selecting certain narratives that reinforce the idea that we live in an oppressive society and that's the best way to understand it. What's funny is a lot of it is not so much directly what teachers say. It's what they don't say. It's what's hidden. So you can find instances, of course, where teachers get on the soapbox and start lecturing and giving, direct ideological instruction, and that happens. But it's in terms of how things are framed, how they're presented, and a lot of it's very, very manipulative. They might be given certain questions which are directed a certain way. They're told to read certain books. They might be reading, when they're reading history books, their teacher gives them Howard Zinn, and he, without telling them that Howard Zinn comes at this from a very specific angle. That's what I see. And I think what parents really need to focus on is what's called and learn about is critical pedagogy. This pedagogy that's being taught to teachers and teachers are being trained in that has these underlying assumptions about what education is, that it's a construct of white supremacy and that we have to deconstruct it by teaching students certain ideas about how society operates and so forth. That's what I see. But you can also see it too in terms of coverage. I mean, we've lost Western civilization in schools. It's now called global studies or, world civilizations. Students are spending the same amount of time studying the Aztecs as they are, maybe even more, than Roman civilization, things that are foundational to our culture and that help us learn about our civilization and culture and transmit it to the next generation. And obviously that's a concern because in my opinion, as a historian, those are the things that brought us to this point to give us this great society. And if a generation loses that, they can lose the culture and the history and the direction we go from there.
Coming up, more with Frank McCormick, teacher and founder of Chalkboard Heresy. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Kind of overdid it in Denver, and I just can't remember her name.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Frank McCormick, teacher, historian, and founder of Chalkboard Heresy. In the last segment, he was talking about how there's been a shift away from Western civilization to highlight other things and other aspects of history and elevate it. And he used an example of the Aztecs. And here I build on that by asking him, or highlighting, as I often say, the importance of context and the flaws of human nature, and talk about what I wrote about in my last book to highlight what they're missing, even if you give them their argument. I am not a historian, but I'm kind of like one because I love history and I study it because I think it's important and it's interesting. And so when I hear people talk about things, I say it so often, how they lose logic and context. And without context, it's just blurry. It doesn't make sense. So the piece you just said about from Western civilization to global studies is really interesting to me. And I understand the Western civilization foundation, and that's important. But, let's go with the global studies. I don't have a problem with it, but it's interesting. So we just spoke about how they don't teach anything positive about America. But you were just talking to Aztecs. So I say this often, in my last book, We Want Equality, I spent an entire opening section of the book laying the foundation of history, not because the book was about history. It's because if I want to talk context, I needed to have a foundation. My point was that human nature is flawed in the book. But in painting that picture, I talked about what happened, a little bit of what happened everywhere in the world at different periods from millennia ago up to 50 years ago. And the point is that, one, people have such hubris that they think they're going to fix humanity. It's laughable, but it's key also to what you just said. So they want to teach the Aztecs instead of the Romans. I'm guessing, I'm not in the classroom, you can verify for me, but I'm going to assume that they're teaching all this negative stuff about slavery and the founders and they own slaves. And they're like, we act like Western, I guess the point you talked about Howard Zinn is that we act like Western civilization is so much greater than everyone else. All these other civilizations existed too, and they're great. So why aren't you teaching, East Africa and East Asia and Africa and things that happened everywhere else, in the Middle East and things of that nature? But I bet they're not teaching negative stuff. So I think people will go, if we follow along this path, people will come out of school knowing a lot about the dangers and the ills of America. Many of it's factual, but no context, and they won't know about the negative things that the Aztecs did. They won't know about the slavery in the Middle East, about the conquering of dynasties in China. They won't know about, how it was just common to burn widows on the pyre, or to eat people, or conquer your enemies and things of that nature. So they'll think slavery is unique to America, but they won't know that of all of the people taken from Africa during the transatlantic slave, that only 3% came to America, and 48% went to Brazil and things of that nature. So they want to teach global studies, but they're going to still focus on the negatives here and no negatives there. So am I close to how they teach global studies?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think it's definitely done through that lens. And to a lot of people, it's confusing because they said, but, it just doesn't make sense. Why would you have these clear examples of terrible things happening here and you don't cover those, or you glaze over them, and then you hyper focus on the terrible things from Western civilization? But it makes sense when you understand what underlies it. And what underlies it is an ideology which divides human beings and society into the good guys and the bad guys. And, it sounds silly, but in some cases, it's really a matter of the West is bad and non-West is good. And that's, you would think that educators would maybe see the world in more complex shades, but a lot of them don't because of this ideological underpinning. So that very heavily influences what they decide to cover and how much detail and what they don't cover. And the biggest danger to me is that they're not even aware of it. They are so invested in this ideology that they don't stop and think about that. Whereas, you and I, as we're saying right now, talking about how great Western civilization is, we'll also say, yeah, some really terrible things happened, and we recognize that. We're reflective and critical of that. So what you notice and what you see is exactly spot on, but it's not accidental. It's purposeful.
Right. But this is all over the media now, and it seems new, but it had to come from somewhere. So we didn't just wake up one day and decide that the education system is so racist, we need to infuse this stuff, or that, curriculum needs to be turned on its head. So I want to get to a bit of, not necessarily the genesis, but the genesis for you. I mean, you didn't start teaching last year. So how have things changed in the last 18 months, or if you want to say, from when you started teaching? What has changed that is so noticeable that maybe it was like the frog in the warm water? You didn't notice it, as it was happening. But if you look at what's going on today and look back at the first 2 or 3 years of teaching, what's different now?
I think what's changed is there'd always been ideology. It had always existed. I think what you have had happen is when George Floyd was killed, that was a catalyst for what we saw in our society, but also in our schools. And it kind of was a wake-up call. And so teachers that had primarily been ideological and radical were energized and motivated and empowered. People that were on the fence kind of bent the knee and committed to this ideology. And those that were in the minority, the 5 to 7% that were maybe conservative, became quiet. And so with those three factors, a lot changed. And I think especially too, there's been increased exposure. This was kind of a ticking time bomb because, I call it kind of, trickle down pedagogy. It came from academia. It used to be relegated to kind of these radical ideas to kind of the halls of academia. And it started to infiltrate teacher education programs. And those people went into schools with a missionary purpose. And from schools, this is now where you see it spreading to children. And I've noticed, even in recent years, even before, the pandemic and George Floyd kind of radicalized a lot of people, my students were starting to use words that I would ask, they'd say, well, this is white privilege and so on and so forth. And I would say, well, what does that mean? And they wouldn't know, or they would have a misunderstanding of what it was, even in the classical sense. So I started to notice a few years ago that these ideas were kind of entering student discourse in a way I'd never seen maybe, when I started 10 years ago.
So let's talk about some of the specific ideas. You mentioned one, white privilege. So what are some of the things that you see that are problematic that are being taught? So white privilege is one. What else? What would you say that you see that really kind of triggers you to say that this is a problem and this is going to be bad?
I would say students' lens for understanding the world seems to have been very heavily influenced by kind of the and I use this word sparingly, but I'll describe it as the Marxist kind of worldview, where students are starting to describe their experiences in kind of these terms of black and white, oppressor, oppressed, and they're starting to identify, they'll say, well, this person did this to me because of white privilege. This happened to me because I'm from this group. So they're starting to use the language. They're starting, so privilege is definitely a big one. You hear that very commonly. That's probably the most basic one. But you also hear students using the word with increased frequency, racism, to describe a lot of things, and sometimes that even don't fit, where they'll start describing certain things. Well, this is racist. That's because I'm this race. That's because you're this race. Their world is kind of being shaded by this. And I think children especially see the world in primary colors already. They see things very simplistically. So this is the perfect ideology for young people because it helps them. They're trying to make sense of the world. Good teachers are trying to teach them the world is complex. It's not black and white. And here you have this ideology that says, no, it's very black and white. Everything makes sense in terms of this kind of conspiratorial framework, and it teaches them to run with it. So at a formative time in their life, now they have a way of understanding the world, like a religion that's being taught in schools. And that's one of the things I've really used heavily is describing in the language of religion.
Coming up, more with Frank McCormick, founder of Chalkboard Heresy. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with an incredibly brave public school teacher, Frank McCormick. And in this segment, I ask him to remove the radicals because they are what they are, but to the well-intentioned teachers who care about the kids, but they're going along with this, I ask him, what does he hear from them? Or to put himself in their mindset and wonder, do they think it's helpful? And if not, why are they allowing this to take place?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some cognitive dissonance there because on the one hand, when you talk to them, they will tell you all day about all the failures of public education and all the problems. And then on the other hand, they speak as true believers about these ideas. I think they're true believers. They believe that these ideas will work. And, one of the things that they will often do is they'll point to kind of this invisible boogeyman. And you'll say, well, are you doing this? Am I doing this? No, but it's out there. It's somewhere in the schools and we have to find it and root it out. And we have to stop teaching history this way. And we have to be culturally relevant. And they'll give you kind of these basic principles, but they're never very good at these specifics. I think a lot of them have good intentions. They're like missionaries, and that's how they see themselves. And they think that they can uplift students this way. But when you start getting down to the nitty gritty, that's where you lose a lot of them, because that's where, even when you read about these theories, they're very light on the specifics. And I think that's what's so hard. You ask them to identify, okay, well, where's white supremacy in schools? And they'll say, well, our suspension rates. And you ask them, where are the white supremacist teachers? Can you name them? And, they won't name them. They don't know, but they're out there somewhere. And, well, what's the solution? And they may not have a solution, or they might say, well, we'll be culturally relevant. What does that mean? So you're arguing a lot of times with these vagaries, and I think that's where it starts to fall apart. When people sometimes they want to get to the specifics, I remind them, I said, a lot of times the teachers themselves, the schools, don't have specifics. They have these vague generalities, and you can press them all day, but you're not going to get them. And that's part of the problem.
I felt so. When I talk to people like that, as rare as I get an opportunity, I wish I could talk more. I don't get argumentative. I don't call names, and I don't say whatever. I give them their argument. You listen to the show, you know that.
Sure.
So I'll say, yeah, you're right. There's a racist boogeyman out there doing X, Y, Z. I'm not even going to debate that it's not true. But given that, how exactly is what you're doing going to help? And I talk about it specifically as a Black parent with Black child and from a Black community, saying, so you want to teach things culturally. Explain to me twofold. One, how does that better? Because the society doesn't give a crap about my culture. Right, wrong, or indifferent, giving you your argument, the white man has privilege and he's a racist. And he's in charge of most of the country. Until that changes, that's the case. So you want the teachers to teach based on the students. So teach the Asian students in an Asian way, teach the Black students in the Black way, and teach the white students in the white way. One, there is no white and Black way of teaching math. That's basically an oppressive mindset to think. You see the stuff out there. I watched the video where the Black professors are saying, well, Blacks read differently. So if you want to teach them to read, you have to teach them to read differently. Foolish and racist, number one. And the second part of that is many of the teachers, you're a rarity. to be honest, a lot of things has happened. You know, I was kind of the last of the youth that went to school where there was a decent number of male teachers, still majority women when I was in school. But I would say 40 to 45% of the teachers were still male. A lot of these schools have 90% women, especially at the very lower. I mean, the male teachers who are willing to teach go to junior high school and high school. It's just what happened. So kindergarten to fifth grade are going to be women. Many of them are going to be young, and a great percentage are going to be white. So now if we buy into this cultural training, we got young white women teaching black students the black way to learn math and reading. So it wouldn't work anyway unless we got an influx of black teachers. So I think what they're doing is detrimental to black, and I think somebody needs to call them out on it. So I don't get into the nitty gritty of arguing about whether they're wrong, even though I believe they're wrong. I simply say, I want the black kids to compete. According to you, you want them to compete. So instead of focusing on what works and making them as good at the STEM as the white students get to learn the code, and we get to learn about Harriet Tubman. And you think in 5 years, the black kid is going to be more equipped to go into the workforce. So even if your intentions are good, I really don't care what they are because you're hurting the students. So I think that that's kind of something that needs to be pointed out, right?
Absolutely. And you're way ahead of the curve on the culturally relevant pedagogy. And I would tell people, if you want to kind of know what's going to be the next controversy, that's what it's going to be, because that's their answer. Their answer is culturally relevant pedagogy. And like you said, it's this idea that even in the book, Geneva Gay, who wrote on culturally responsive teaching, says race and intellectuality, an exact quote, are inseparably tied, that different races have different learning styles. Now, learning styles as a whole, I know, learning styles have been debunked, and she's taking a debunked idea, something that was disproven by good psychological research, and now she's applying it to different races. And I remember hearing this idea has been around for a long time. When I was going through my teacher education program, reading books where they would talk about black students are kinesthetic learners and they learn better through music. And I would say, what on earth does that mean? I mean, it's soft bigotry, and it's really dangerous, because if you believe that and you are tailoring curriculum and instruction under this premise that black students learn differently, you're denying them their God-given right to an equal and fair education, which is so ironic. And, you know, I think we need to very forcefully reject that. And a lot of this is based on old anthropology that's been disproven. And if you look at the studies, they just don't hold up.
Coming up, more with Frank McCormick, founder of Chalkboard Heresy. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Frank McCormick, teacher, historian, and founder of Chalkboard Heresy. In the last segment, he pointed out the awful and racist teachings of people who supposedly are proponents of helping black students, focusing on culturally responsive teaching, trying to make the argument that blacks learn differently. And here I give him as I've often given people their argument, my interesting retort to such comments. If that woman said that to me, I wouldn't say you're wrong, even though I think it's wrong. I would say, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Thanks for teaching me that. But then if that's the case, why are you pushing for diversity? It seems like if cultural learning is the best way for minority students to learn, shouldn't we just keep everybody in separate schools? Because we got this admission thing I talk about all the time. You got de Blasio saying there's not enough black and brown students in the selective enrollment school. Now you got the lawsuit. I talked to Aaron Wilcox from the Pacific Legal Foundation the other day about a lawsuit for the Asian American students because their percentage has been diminished at TJ, which is the #1 high school in the country. But I'm like, the real question should be, why do you want the black kids in TJ? If the schools are in the suburbs are majority white, or in this one's majority Asian, and blacks learn differently, shouldn't we have black schools with black teachers and black students and just teach them in the cultural way you need to teach them instead of trying to move? And besides, it's odd that diversity only goes one way. So they want to take the black students and they want them to go to TJ, which is majority Asian. They want them to go to school X, which is majority white. But they never want the Asian and the white students to go to the black schools. So 90% black schools are okay. Nobody's trying to break those up. So you don't even believe the diversity, which is, again, oppressive because you're assuming black equals less. right? You say that people on the right think that, but that's what you're saying when you say black school is fine. If black want to go to their own school, that's cool. But blacks need to be able to go to the white schools because you're saying white is better. So you have to hit them with their own logic and have them, kind of debate themselves out of their own flawed thinking. And I think that's what's happening. So the diversity thing is not really what they want it to be. And I just think people should challenge them on that. So, but I want your thoughts on that, and then I want to talk about why the schools are failing because I know in Chicago and many major cities we have a large percentage of school students who are either dropping out or being passed through. So even with the curriculum changes and shifting admissions and all that kind of stuff, it has done nothing in the last 2 or 3 decades on the number of kids who are failing. So what do we do about that?
Well, yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. What you were saying about this idea of segregation, it's funny you say that because I have heard that with increasing frequency where now this is probably from the more radical staff members arguing that maybe that is the answer. Maybe we do need reclaim education for our own. And now their workaround for that is to increase hiring of black teachers and so forth. But what's funny is they never talk about that. You can teach in a district that's maybe 80% Hispanic, and they won't talk about hiring Hispanic teachers. So there's a certain agenda based on this. And I've asked, I said, what about a white community? And, should we get more white teachers in there? Make sure that's a priority. And they flip it on you. They say, well, actually studies show that, black teachers are good for white students too. And so, they play these games with you. They always, this is where we have to, teachers especially, and people like me, and this is what I'm trying to do, be better about educating the public, because they'll refer you to these studies. They'll say, well, studies say that kids that have a teacher that looks like them do better. And you start to look at these studies and there's huge problems with them. There's selection bias. There's no control. They haven't been repeated. One of the big studies that was trying to prove, and this isn't to say that you don't want diversity in your teaching staff. It's just to look at the argument that it's the most important determination. Mm-hmm. And where they did these studies and they brought in or they looked at a black teacher with a majority black class. And one of the studies, there was no effect measured in the girls. So I thought to myself, I said, how can you make such a broad sweeping conclusion when half of the population you're studying showed no improvement based on teacher ethnicity? That's a big red flag in research. Mm-hmm. So be skeptical when they cite the research. Don't be intimidated when they start waving around. Look through it yourself. Just do a little preliminary background. That's what I tell people. But you're absolutely right on that issue of the argument of race-based hiring and having teachers that reflect the students. It does go one way, and in my opinion, it doesn't hold up as an argument. Now, on the issue of schools, you wanted to ask what are the biggest problems I see, like on a concrete level. Why are we failing? Correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that is we lack. There's no opportunities and choices outside of kind of the prescribed modality of learning. We're used to choice in every avenue of our lives. When we go to the grocery store, we have innumerable choices with toothpaste, but with education, it's you must go to this school on this location and take these classes, and you have to be there. We're going to force you. And then you have this autocratic bureaucracy. And one of the things that stood out to me when I first started teaching is that the institution itself is primarily concerned with its appearance. It's not concerned with outcomes. It's concerned with the appearance of looking like a school. There's a lot of pomp and pageantry. It's about graduation rates. It's about GPA, all things that can be manipulated. This is why they don't like standardized testing, and they try to attack it, even though we know a lot of the results are valid and these are very well designed tests and have been heavily scrutinized. There's efforts to undermine the results of standardized testing because they point a spotlight on the schools and say, you can show us all this data on what you're doing right, but at the end of the day, 10% of your students are coming out reading at grade level. What's going on, guys?
Coming up, my final segment with Frank McCormick, founder of Chalkboard Heresy. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Frank McCormick, founder of Chalkboard Heresy. And in the conversation so far, we've talked about critical pedagogy, the problems of focusing on race, and the twisted belief that Blacks learn differently. We talk about what he's seen and heard in the schools, and we talked about the fact that many of the schools are failing, and tried to pinpoint some of the problems as to, outside of this new push, just why the schools are struggling and failing and what should be done. And here in the last segment, I had to ask, as wonderful as it is that he is speaking up and he's becoming a force, why now? He's been a teacher for a while and he wasn't speaking before. So what triggered that? Here is the last segment. I want to leave with the fact that you're speaking up now and you weren't before. So really quickly, what drove you to speak? What was the light switch that said, I got to say something?
I think after last summer of 2020, when I saw the violence in our streets and I saw, I'm not talking about Confederate statues. I'm talking about statues of Lincoln and George Washington coming tumbling down. And and I saw this chaos in the streets. And I said, what underlies this? I said, it's ideology. And I said, where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from a lot of the universities. And I said, okay. I said, so this is a snapshot. This is a preview. What happens when this ideology comes to grade school, to kindergarten, to high school? Mm-hmm. And I started to see it happening. And I said, okay. I said, so now you have ideological instruction in education. What happens every year with each generation going out there? And I started to be, I became scared. I said, this is a preview of what our future could look like. Because every one of those people that was rioting and burning and tearing things down and screaming revolution, I get that they were mad, but they had an ideology underpinning that. And so I started to think, I said, if someone doesn't I can't wait anymore for someone else to do it. And there's a price to silence. And the price now has become too great compared to the risk.
So you launched a website called Chalkboard Heresy. Where does the name come from?
So, I chose the word heresy because a lot of the language we're using now to describe this kind of, what some people refer to as wokeness, it's starting to be classified almost as a religious movement by critics. And that's kind of how I've come to see it. And I've come to look at schools as kind of like the churches of this ideological movement. Teachers, I said, we've kind of become like the priests. We proselytize, we spread the ideology and this message. And so I realized what I was, is I said, if this is a religion, I'm a heretic. And so I decided rather to avoid that, kind of embrace it. Yes, I'm a heretic of this new orthodoxy, and this is Chalkboard Heresy, what I'm teaching. So that's where I got the name from.
Yeah, people should go to the site and read your blog and look at your stuff. I love it. It's dripping in religious context and analogies, and it's really good. It's really powerful and forceful. It took you a while to come out, but when you came out swinging. And I look forward to reading more of your stuff, seeing you everywhere else. I know that there's a lot that you're going to be working on, and it's going to be really important stuff. Hopefully more teachers will, because there's got to be others who think like you who are afraid, but they'll say, well, he's doing it, so I'm going to do it. And you can build your brand and get more people on board and become the teacher wing of what 1776 Unites and FAIR and all these other organizations are, because it is definitely needed. He is Frank McCormick, public school teacher, historian, and founder of Chalkboard Heresy. Thank you so much for joining me, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Charles, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.